Okay, just as a review from last week, I handed out these very simple sheets here, which is called Take Hold of Your Mind. And on that side where it says reasonable mind, we're dealing with the gift that God has given us called the intellect, the ability to reason. And so we've gone through at least, I think we went through the first three of Thomas Aquinas' argument for the existence of God, which is motion, cause, being, and gradation and design. And so we have on the other side a kind of a more affective, emotional dimension of the human being, which gravitates towards being created and realizing that we exist, thank God. And then, of course, being captured by the things that constitute that which leads us away from God, doubts, various temptations, various things that are very clearly described as that which is not in our best spiritual interest or not in our interest at all, physically, mentally, or spiritually. And then we have being rescued, coming to a sense of what do we call maybe emotional maturity, or a sense of knowing the ropes in life and being your own best friend and helping you to be able to survive, get along with others, and have some, at least at a very minimal, altruistic understanding of the importance of us relating to each other in a very helpful, supportive manner. Okay, that takes care of that. And then respond. How do you respond to the gift of life that you have? What are you going to do with your life? What are your plans? What are your goals? What do you want to achieve? How can you create the world that you live in comparison to relationships with other people in the worlds they've created, and a common thing which we call living in community, culture, society. Okay, very good. So we always have to examine our state of mind. Of course, for us as a people of faith, that involves examining our conscience, of course. But the whole thing is we oftentimes, maybe ask the question at some point in our life, how's that working for you? It may or may not be working for you. And then, of course, if it's not working for you, you need to address that issue as to why it's not working for you. And then, of course, try to get things to work for you. With the help of others, obviously. We can't do that on our own. No man is an island. Okay, now, I think as we get into this further continuing argumentation of Thomas Aquinas in, the five ways, all addressing the two major questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Pretty simple question. Why is there something and rather not nothing? So we're all talking about the concept, which is actually a relatively, new concept in terms of the Enlightenment, nothingness. When you talk about nothingness. Okay, well, here we go. Now, the first argument was the argument from motion. Okay, we dealt with that adequately last time. And then the second one was the argument from efficient cause, which we delved into that also. And then I think we'll start with the argument to necessary being. What is necessary? Okay, what is necessary in your life? What is necessary in your beliefs? What is necessary in terms of what is the challenge of addressing our various needs and necessities. The argument to necessary being, since all existent things depend upon other things. Okay, there seems to be a continuum here of dependency upon other things. In order for our existence to continue, we have to have some sense of dependency on other existing things, okay, in the universe and the world in which we live. Okay, now there must exist at least one thing, look at the logic of this, at least one thing that is not dependent and is so a necessary being. There has to be, in logic, as you extrapolate and make connections and so on and so forth, that there is our necessity to exist in relationship to other existent beings, the reality of the physical world that exists, so the whole thing is how do we exist and how is that a dependency upon other existing things. Okay, so it's a kind of continuum. Well, the logic of that, when we think about a beginning, okay, is that basically there has to be in logic a being that is absolutely necessary for all other things to exist, for all other beings to be beings. Okay? I mean, the logic of that is sort of impeccable. It's kind of hard to argue against that. And so anyway, that whole thing about necessary being, of course we know that God is a necessary being in that logic. Okay? And again, whatever you want to call him, the unmoved mover, the creator, that whole thing about the oneness of an initiating intelligence or being that was responsible for all other beings. Okay? I think the thing is, an example would be a man and a woman is absolutely necessary for the being of a child, even coming into being. Okay? So if you look at it from that perspective, our being given birth into existence, there has to be an initiating being. That's the logic of it. Okay, now the next one is the argument for gradation. Gradation. Okay, what do we mean by that? Okay. Since all existent things can be compared to such qualities as degrees of goodness. Degrees of goodness. Is something gooder than something else? That's not even good English. Is something better than something else? Goodness. What is goodness? How do we assess and make a judgment as to what is good? Like we could say this as an example. In sports, man, you're really good. They're really good. Okay? But somebody might say, yeah, but somebody so-and-so is better. So somebody's good, but somebody may be really good. Okay, so we're making this assessment as to what is good. And so when we think about that whole sense of degrees of goodness, something that works for us is good. Okay, we oftentimes make judgments upon people that they're so good, or you can say about somebody, they're so bad. So they must be lacking in some degree of goodness. So somebody could be a little bit good, a little bit bad. How do we make all these assessments and judgments as to what constitutes what is good? And of course, good is a concept, but because we regard ourselves as intelligent beings, somewhat special in nature, okay, we give ourselves the privilege to be able to judge that which is good. Okay? We don't know if any other animal on the face of the earth makes that kind of assessment. Good. Does one squirrel say to another, yeah, he's a really good squirrel? When you think about that, it gets kind of ridiculous, but it gets to the point of, we make these assessments of goodness. Now, the one thing that we as human beings have a quandary over is that we start to deal with absolutes. What is absolutely good? That was absolutely good. Is there any such thing as absolutely good? Are there any such things as absolutes? We make those kinds of judgments, but in this gradation of degrees of goodness, logically, there must exist something that is an absolutely good being. Okay? When we're making these assessments about what is good, whether it's an inanimate object, whether it's, this or that, human beings, or whatever, or that tastes good. How do you make that assessment? It tastes good or bad. It tastes bad. What makes taste bad to somebody may taste good to somebody else. Whatever. So we make those kind of judgments. So in that regard, the absolutely good being, and the definition of all goodness, because we in Catholic theology believe that creation is good. Creation is good. And God did good. Okay? And even it says, he took a look at what he created and he said, yeah, man, it's good. When we think about God thinking, okay, as the absolute, perfect intellect. Even thinking about striving for absolutes, the whole thing about perfection. How do we make a judgment as to what we regard as something that's perfect? Okay. And oftentimes, people are labeled as a perfectionist. Perfectionist. A perfectionist is someone who's striving for perfection. And how many times do we hear, nobody's perfect? Even to just say that nobody's perfect must mean that we have some concept of perfection. See the logic of that? This logic is so very clear, you know? And so in that sense, this absolutely good being is what we would identify as believers as Almighty God. Almighty. Okay. All good. All knowing. You know? And that's just something that is so difficult for some people to wrap their mind around or even accept. And that's when we get to the questions towards the end of the session I'm going to give you all about that. And why there is such a resistance to the kind of logic that I just presented is a very interesting aspect and characteristic of intellectuality for God, against God, or no God. Okay, we look at it from that perspective. Okay, now the fifth way is the argument for design, from design. Now this is one that's most commonly understood by people. We all know design, okay? And I remember I briefly took in high school drafting. How many here have ever had drafting? Raise your hand, drafting. Remember the drafting board, the T-square, and all that stuff? Design. You know, there's something on that paper that doesn't exist, but it can exist when you create it from that design. Isn't that magnificent? Buildings and everything, you know, the designer, architects, engineers. Talk about intelligent people. You know, if you got that knack to be a designer, man, I'll tell you, you got a nice job. Okay, so now taking a look at that, the argument for design. Also named, now this is a biggie, I'm getting a little technical here, okay? Also named the teleological argument. Teleological. I'm not going to spell that, but anyway, it's neither here nor there, but it's interesting nonetheless. I'll explain basically what that means. Teleological, intelligence, figuring things out, designing, you know, creating, you know, all that magnificent stuff that we like to pride ourselves as Homo sapiens, spiritual, physical, you know, mental beings in comparison to all other creatures upon the face of the earth. Okay, so here we go. Now, the intricate design and order of existent things and natural processes imply that a great designer exists. Somebody came up with the term, what was it? The designed intelligence. Okay, the intelligent designer. Okay, because this is another way to talk about God. If you believe in God, you get given a number of different labels. You know, the grand designer. You know, designed everything, you know, created everything. Okay, the great designer exists. Design, the intelligent design. You take a look at the universe, and you take a look at the order of things. Okay, the conclusion in a certain manner of logic, there has to be an intelligent designer for everything. Hey, I remember, you know, reading that for us to exist, for human beings to exist on this planet, taking into account that we pretty much think that we're the only intelligent beings in the universe, which may or may not be true, we don't know. We sort of like, or sort of, let's take a look at Mars. There ain't nothing there. We ain't sent a guy there yet. Did we send a guy there yet? No, we haven't yet. But I think the thing is, you take a look at, you look at Rover. They got that little mechanical thing. That somebody designed that little mechanical thing. It's wandering around Mars, you know. And when you see this in videos, they put a background music like there's a wind. There's a wind on Mars or not. But anyway, and so it's scanning the horizon. There's nothing but a bunch of rocks. Then there's mountains. And then they zero in on something that looks weird. And they're saying, did something design that? Or is it just a weird rock? Guys, you know, being paid to do this kind of stuff. They do a good job. These are, you know, designers, intelligent people, scientists, whatever you want to call them. Okay, so now, for us to exist, everything has to be exactly in place. The temperature on the planet. See, now this whole thing now, but this argument about, global warming. Oh my gosh. Just think, if the temperatures begin to change and the polar ice caps begin to melt, heck, we're going to lose Florida. California, parts of California, oh my God. And so all these little things have to be perfectly in place for things to be the way they are. And so when we take a look at that whole sense of the great designer, okay, then we begin to understand the logic that as we sort of project, I'm tempted to say as we project back into time, because we have to deal with time, there had to be a beginning. Now, a little later on, I'm going to get into the anomaly as an explanation of the Big Bang Theory. Bang! Okay. We got all this stuff projecting out into nothingness. The Big Bang. Okay. All right. Then the question to be asked, it's a very good question, is there such thing as nothingness? Is there any such thing as nothing? So when we think about the Big Bang Theory, okay, does that mean the Big Bang just happened and came out of nothing? Well, I guess you could believe that if you want to, but then again, that gets into the argumentation as the idea of beginning. Is there such thing as a beginning when there needs to be a dependency on other beginnings? So there has to be an ultimate beginning, but there has to be an initiating, whether you want to call it being, intelligence, or force, that brought about that being. So in terms of certain logic, there had to be a being that already be. I don't know if that's good English, but anyway. So we can reasonably logically say, in certain parameters of what we're discussing here, is there had to be a being that never had a beginning, that always was, always is, and always will be. So the logic of the faith perspective is clear in that regard. But then, when someone says the universe is not dependent on a creator, because the initiating laws of even zeroing in on the law of gravity, that one may be able to argue that gravity is responsible for creation. Is that making gravity a god? I don't know. But it certainly eradicates the concept of a being. And we're dealing with a physical law. And there's an argumentation, for that, which I'll go into a little bit later. But anyway, okay. And so anyway, as we get close to conclusion for this session, I want to take a look at this statement. St. Thomas thought we can know about God in two ways. In two ways. By reason, the logic of we just discussed, right? That's reason, that's logic. Okay, so we can know about God in that way, by reason, and by grace. Grace. Yeah. It's just like Jesus said to Peter when he said, "You are the Son of God." And Jesus said, "Peter, you did not know that of your own volition, but the grace of the Father, He gave you that ability to know that." That's grace. It's a perfect example of grace. That Peter could respond in that way with such definite affirmation. It was the grace of God that enabled him to believe. You know, it's Soren Kierkegaard, okay? He just comes to mind thinking about this. He characterized this whole sense that you can know what you know. You know, you can have all this empirical knowledge. You can know Immanuel Kant and his categorization of things and philosophical structures of thought and organization, you know. And what he said, it comes to the point where you have to take that leap. You have to take that leap. And that is the leap of faith. And so that's the second way, the leap of faith. Now, the problem, if you want to call it a problem, if you take that leap of faith, you're going to feel to a certain degree that you're taking a risk. Because you need to make a decision as to whether you trust in that decision to believe in God. So is that going to change you? If you don't make that leap, you can stay pretty secure in what you know. But when you start to delve into the unknown of taking a leap of faith, you're entering into the unknown. You're taking a risk. And you're going to have to trust that decision. It's a magnificent thing. That's what differentiates us from all the other sentient beings on the face of the earth. You don't call them sentient, you know. Other beings that have some modicum or some, you know, evidence of thought that we can discern by observing them and scientifically experimenting with them. Like Pavlov's dog. You know, Pavlov figured out that a dog can learn how to push a button to get some food. Whoa, whoa. Is he thinking? Or you talk about the chimpanzee that takes this little stick and puts it in the termite mound, you know, pulls it out, and there's termites and he eats it and says, is he creating a tool? Has he thought out the usefulness of a tool? Does that make him like us? You didn't know all this stuff, man.
What can we tune into for next week, Father?
Okay, next week, okay. The whole thing that we're going to zero into is I'm going to make a kind of a comparison between empirical means of thought, science and religion. I'm going to touch on this a little bit, and then I'll eventually get into some deeper thoughts about what Thomas Aquinas believed was true and not true in certain forms of logic. So, all right. I got some questions.
Thank you, Father. All right, do we need to record anymore? Are we good?
Is that-
All right.